As we saw last time with OK Records and the 1920 recording of Crazy Blues by Mamie Smith, the song by Perry Mule Bradford, we saw that record companies now had an opportunity, especially small record companies. Because at first, companies like Victor, Columbia actually surprisingly jumped on the whole race records thing relatively early, but some of the other big record companies like Victor, they're a little more reluctant. That's the problem with large record companies, right? They're always going to be a little more reluctant to pursue innovation because they're trying to maintain what they feel they've already been doing well, and they're trying to maintain their market without a lot of risk. But for these smaller groups, these smaller record companies, they see here an opportunity. There's a market that people didn't even realize was a market. There are ways to make recordings that are relatively cheap. That's the other thing that's Crazy Blues, of course, for OK Records. That's a pretty good sounding recording. But soon, when you have these portable recording studios and you're doing remote recordings, no one's expecting the quality to be that great. In fact, that becomes part of, this may or may not be surprising for us now, but that becomes part of the mystique of these recordings, is that they in their kind of less than polished presentation, they connote a kind of authenticity. They suggest that you're getting at something real. This is partly why, and we'll talk about this later, some of the early folk recordings that were collected by Harry Smith, and sometimes they're used to describe what is called the old weird America. They're enjoyed in part because they are scratchy recordings. That seems to be part of their authenticity. And so once you have the blues singers that are being recorded, like Mamie Smith, who, like we said last time, not really a blues singer, but she sang the first recording of the blues, and then you have Gertrude Mulroney and Bessie Smith. This opens a market, not just for female blues singers, although they are a major part of that market, but then people are starting to wonder, well, let's see what the blues sounds like in the South. Let's see what people are playing down there and see if we can market that as well. And so they turn to the South and they turn to the guitar players and the singers, mostly male singers, down there. And that's what we're talking about today. So you have three basic geographical areas that apply to the blues that we're talking about today, the country blues, right? So, and when we're talking about the country blues, for the most part, what we're talking about is a single guitarist, sometimes a banjo player, but usually a guitarist, sometimes with an accompanist, a second guitarist, but usually by himself, and it's a male singer, self-accompanied, right? And will alternate between singing and more elaborate guitar playing. And there are various approaches to the guitar that are distinct in part because of these geographical areas and therefore distinct traditions. But for the most part, what we're talking about is a solo singer, self-accompanied. And we have three geographical areas. We've got the Delta, which is, of course, the most famous. This is the area that most people talk about when you have this notion in your head of the country blues. Usually it's the Delta that you have in your mind. Those performers tend to have a strong sense of pulse, not always a strong sense of meter, but a strong sense of pulse. So, for instance, when we listen to Robert Johnson, you'll notice that every now and then there's a measure of 3/4 or whatever in the middle of everything, or 2/4 in an overall 4/4 context, but the pulse stays very strong. So, a strong sense of pulse. This is more chord-based music. And then lots of falsetto, especially singers like Tommy Johnson, and we'll look at him on the next slide. And then a lot of use of the bottleneck, right? Remember, that's the kind of blues that W.C. Handy heard when he was in that train station, right? When he said that someone was playing with the bottleneck and reproducing the sounds of like a Hawaiian guitar almost, right? And that was part of what gave it that eerie sound. So a lot of that's the Delta-based stuff. Texas-based country music tends to have a much looser sense of pulse. They speed up and slow down a lot. Sometimes they drop the sense of pulse altogether to play something that feels almost out of time. And this is music that's a little more riff-based. So they'll have a figure that repeats over and over again. Now, you might think that riff-based music implies that one would have a steady pulse throughout, and that's not a bad thought on your part. But when you listen to Blind Lemon Jefferson and so on, you'll see how he manipulates those repeated riffs to really blur a sense of regularity in time, and that's part of what gives that music its own kind of strange temporal quality. Then there's the Piedmont blues, which is the least thought of by most people. It's my favorite. It's much more virtuosic, much cleaner vocals. The reason it's sometimes ignored is because it's much closer to ragtime. So the chord progressions are much more complicated. There's a lot of clever polyphony. The bass lines alternate 1 and 5. So this heavy ragtime influence, much more sophisticated playing than the others, as we'll see. So the delta, and some style characteristics overall. You've got a fairly loose sense of meter. So in pretty much all the styles, but especially in the delta and in Texas. So delta has steady pulse. Texas a little less steady pulse, but they both are free with the sense of meter. The meter is really determined more by what the performer's doing in the moment, in a sense, right? When they're singing, it tends to be 4/4. It's the stuff in between, the filler stuff, where they don't seem to be as concerned with the exact meter. They're not playing with the drummer. They're not playing with other people. So they're very free as far as how long something goes. So it's very typical, and really in all three styles, the Piedmont included, that the instrumental break in between phrases of singing will not stick to the 4/4 meter. This is music that proliferated through an oral tradition, so we're not talking about scores. Remember, we talked last time about scores, the Negro Blues in 1912, and the Memphis Blues later that year, and the St. Louis Blues 1914. Those are the earliest scores of the blues, but those are ragtime pieces, really. They have the blues as part of, as one strain within an overarching ragtime piece. The actual blues, the country blues, that's not published until much, much later. Even when it starts to be recorded, they're not bothering to publish these songs. These songs are in an oral tradition, and that means several things. That means that the songs don't have a set identity. As they get passed from one person to another, they change quite a bit. So you'll hear different songs with different titles by different artists, and you can tell that they come from the same source. They have some of the same lines. They have the same basic melodic figures. These become these kind of stock figures or if you wish, cliches that get passed around a lot, right? Woke up this morning, right? It's a very typical beginning of a blues song. I woke up this morning, you were still on my mind, or I woke up this morning feeling low, or whatever. It doesn't matter. But that gesture, if I woke up this morning and this was the situation, it's a very typical blues cliche, and there are a ton of others, right? Nothing. There's the blues is just a good man feeling bad, or whatever. That's another very typical one. You have a use, especially in the delta, of the falsetto voice. So listen to Tommy Johnson's Canned Heat Blues for a great example of that from 1928. And these songs tend to feature these little snapshots of sometimes lurid scenes or thoughts rather than a cohesive narrative. They usually, unlike the Victoria Spivey blues approach to blues, these blues tend to be these almost found snippets of language rather than telling a story from beginning to end. So they're trying to get at an emotional quality. And of course you have the 12-bar format, right? The lyrics are AAB. You have a line, it gets repeated, then there's a follow-up. And you have 3 4-measure phrases. The first one is basically a prolongation of 1. The second one moves from 4 back to 1. And the third goes 5, sometimes with 4 in between, back to 1, and then a turnaround that ends up on 5 that puts us ready to go to the next strain back to 1. Notice the voice leading of 1/7 to 4/7 allows for that blue note, the flat 3 of the scale, to come out. So let's take a look first at the Texas blues. We've got Blind Lemon Jefferson here, and this is one of his obviously promotional photographs. He first recorded the blues in 1926. He's the first country blues artist to record. Notice that's a full 6 years after Crazy Blues of 1920. And he's recording on Paramount Records. And a lot of these early country blues recordings are on Paramount Records. They had, because they were tied to a furniture company, of course, they had offices all over the country. They were fairly successful. The Wisconsin Furniture Company was a very successful company. And so they had offices in the South and had access to some of these players. They advertised Jefferson as, quote, real old-fashioned blues, or his releases as real old-fashioned blues by a real old-fashioned blues singer. So notice that they're advertising this as the old-fashioned blues, not the newfangled stuff from 1920 on with the female blues singers. This is the older approach. He's the greatest early example of Texas blues. He also recorded ragtime and church songs. So again, like the Piedmont Players, he does more than just a straightforward 12-bar blues. And I think that's an interesting thing, right? Blues is a very difficult thing to talk about in some ways because it's all sorts of different things. You could say that the blues is a sort of set of harmonic practices, the use of seventh chords on degrees that don't usually have dominant seventh chords on them, right? So the dominant seventh isn't necessarily a sign of tension, because you can use it right at the beginning on the tonic chord, and so it doesn't and often these songs end with a blues cliche that ends on a 1/7 chord, dominant 7 chord, and so you have that element. You've got the flat third in the melody, you've got the sort of vernacular of the blues in that sense, you've got the form, the 12-bar form, but that's not enough, right, to describe what's going on. So the ragtime isn't really, I don't think of it, as some people do, as separate from the blues. So I don't think of Blind Lemon Jefferson as doing blues and ragtime. He performs blues songs that are more traditional blues and songs that are more traditional ragtime, but it's all part of his overarching approach as a blues singer and performer. So the ragtime gets absorbed into the blues. When he does church songs, he goes by a different name, Reverend L.J. Bates. So you can see Lemon Jefferson in the L.J. He has this very nasal and clear vocal style. He slides into and out of pitches, all the things you're told not to do when you're a chorus singer, for instance. Very riff-based guitar, thick texture, and an unsteady sense of beat. So listen to the song I assigned for him to get a sense of that. And the guitar is really an extension of his voice. So there's a lot of these single-line runs in a kind of call and response fashion. Another Texas blues artist is Blind Willie Johnson, right? He's a gospel blues singer and evangelist, and his most important recordings were from 1927 to 1930. 30 songs he recorded in 5 sessions, so quite busy for a little while there. He has a very powerful chest voice and a very interesting approach to slide guitar. His most influential tunes include Nobody's Fault But Mine, and the slide guitar on that. His approach to that in general is amazing. Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground, Jesus Make Up My Dying Bed, and John the Revelator. He released all these on Columbia, and he was very successful. Those of you who are fans of Led Zeppelin will recognize the titles, and when you listen to them, the songs, Nobody's Fault But Mine and Jesus Make Up My Dying Bed, they did versions of both of those songs. And you'll hear that in a lot of ways, the Blind Willie Johnson originals are just as weird, just as interesting, just as complex as those Led Zeppelin versions. He was really ahead of his time in a lot of ways. He was paid $50 per usable slide, which is a pretty good price at the time. He's not getting much when it comes to residuals, if anything. Basically he got that much money in order to forfeit copyright. So the idea was that if they pay him $50 per side, then they don't have to pay him again. So whenever he recorded a song they thought they could sell, he got $50, which again, good amount of money at that time, but that means it's over. They have no financial obligation to him after that. He hums along with his slide guitar, and that produces this weird, what's sometimes called a unison moan, and it's very distinctive. Once you hear him, if you ever have a drop the needle kind of game that you play with your friends, you'll never mistake him once you get used to that sound. So check him out. Moving over to the Delta Blues. Delta Blues, of course, not the first recorded, because Lemon Jefferson was the first recorded country blues artist. But it's the Delta Blues that in most of our minds is the center of the tradition, in part because of Robert Johnson, and we'll talk about him in a moment. The forefather, if you will, of this style, as far as its recorded output is concerned, is Charlie Patton. You can see that Charlie Patton, he's kind of a showman in a lot of ways, and you can already see elements of that in the way that he's seated there and he's holding his fingers on the guitar in an entirely inappropriate manner. That's not how anyone plays the guitar, including him. But he had all sorts of different tricks that he employed, and I think that might be a way of him sort of demonstrating that. This is a promotional photograph. Obviously, it's quite a nice photograph for the time. He started off playing on these Saturday night parties in the Delta, so these work camps, these plantations where people were working, and he would show up on Saturday night and play, and people would throw money at him and so on. And he is the beginning of the recorded Delta tradition. He had a number of tricks, kind of the Jimi Hendrix of his day. He'd throw the guitar in the air during a break, right? So if he's playing a song and it has a stop, like you hit a chord and it stops for a full measure, he'd throw the guitar up in the air, catch it, and then be ready to play the downbeat for the next measure. He would use the guitar as a drum. Some people say he even played behind his back once in a while, kind of like Hendrix. He had all these different little tricks. In 1929, he's discovered by Henry Spear, who is a white record store owner in Jackson, Mississippi, and he's a talent scout for Paramount and for some other record companies. Henry Spear has a very close contact with a lot of the people that we're talking about today, the most important being his contact with Patton and then with Robert Johnson. Again, he also recorded church songs, and then he would record under a pseudonym. So in this case, it was J.J. Hadley. The song I want you to listen to is Tom Russian Blues from 1929. And this was apparently in honor of a local deputy named Tom Russian, or maybe it was the local sheriff, I don't remember. But at any rate, Patton had a bit of an alcohol problem and a partying problem and a sleeping with other men's wives problem, and so a fighting problem, and he would wind up getting jailed, but apparently he didn't take it amiss, and he enjoyed hanging out with Tom Russian, and so this is a song about that, and you can hear this homage to his jailer in essence. Now, Son House worked with Patton at parties. His style, Son House's style, is very pared down, very minimalist in comparison to Charlie Patton on the one hand and Robert Johnson on the other. He often used single line riffs, so in that sense he's a little closer to the Texas style. And some of his tunes just involved a single chord. So Death Letter Blues, really, he barely leaves that one chord. He just hammers away at it. But what becomes interesting is the rhythmic drive of the piece and the plaintive, listen to Death Letter Blues, the plaintive approach to his singing is quite remarkable. Son House is an interesting figure in a number of ways. He had a series of qualms about being a performer of popular entertainment. He was raised religious, and he felt that this was the devil's music in some ways, and so he would quit and then come back, and then quit and then come back, and he was very conflicted about the whole idea of playing this kind of music. Of course, the most famous, in part because he's the most mysterious, is Robert Johnson. He seems to have been trained by Son House. Certainly Son House claims that he was trained by him, that Johnson was trained by him. You have the stories, of course, about Robert Johnson going out to the Crossroads, that he would show up at these Saturday night parties and he wasn't able to play very well, and Son House picked on him a bit, and other people would pick on him, and there's this story of him having guitars thrown at him and so on, and then he disappears for a while, and one day he comes back and he plays in this amazing way and sings in this amazing way, and the legend goes around, in part because he has a song called Crossroads that more or less says similar things or has similar images. The notion is that he went to the Crossroads and sold his soul to the devil in order to be able to play in this amazing fashion. This, of course, this legend of selling your soul at the crossroads, this has African roots. It goes back to these beliefs in these gods that inhabit, or demigods that inhabit uh, places where you have to make a decision. So these are related to the ancient Greek genie Loki, right? The geniuses of the place, which are not really geniuses. They're almost like genies. They're these spiritual figures that come up and try to help you make decisions or help you pick a path. And so some of this isn't as evil as it might sound. It's not as satanic as it might sound. The devil in folk culture of especially country folk culture of the early 20th century is not the same devil that you see in revival meetings and so on from the same period also in the South, but there's a sort of folk devil that he's a slickster, he's a trickster and a sly figure, and he will dupe you, but it's not necessarily eternal damnation exactly. He's a trickster figure. At any rate, once again, Henry Spear arranged for the first recording with Brunswick Records at the Gunter Hotel in room 414. We have all this information because he's very well studied, even though there's very little to know about him. So this is in San Antonio from November 23rd to 25th in 1936. And then he records again in Dallas in 37. So he's playing in Texas, but he's playing in a Delta style, and he comes from the Delta area. His recordings are the most celebrated in blues history, in part because of figures like Eric Clapton and so on, who really claim to revere him and study his style. The Columbia A&R man John Hammond wanted Johnson to play on the 1938 From Spirituals to Swing Carnegie Hall concert, which we'll talk about more later, but he had to replace him with Big Bill Broonzy when he heard that Johnson had died. So this is this very mysterious figure. We don't know a whole lot about him. There's only a handful of recordings, but they're very celebrated recordings. Let's talk a bit about the Piedmont Blues. This is in some ways the least familiar of the styles. It's the most sophisticated. It's the most influenced by ragtime. One of the great players in this style is, of course, Blind Blake. He's originally from Florida, and he's a representative of the style, the Piedmont style. It's very highly polyphonic and virtuosic, very sophisticated and complicated approach to the guitar. Blind Blake excelled at ragtime and the blues, and he blurs the distinction. I don't think it's a worthwhile distinction when you're really talking about someone like Blind Blake to say, oh, well, this is the blues or this is a ragtime, because he will have these chord progressions that he's enriched, let's say, that are basically blues progressions, but he's enriched them with descending fifth progressions and or third progressions that are more typical of ragtime. And I'll talk a bit about this in the podcast on the blues. Not much is known about him other than that he was blind. A lot of these, you've noticed that there's Blind Lemon Jefferson, there's Blind Willie Johnson, Blind Willie McTell, who we'll get to in a moment, Blind Blake. Blindness is very typical among the early blues guitarists, in part because guitar or music in general was something they could do to make a living. They couldn't work in factories. They tended to have more itinerant lifestyles, and so being this musician, being a musician, allowed them to make ends meet. And really, Blind Blake and Blind Lemon Jefferson, they also create a kind of mystique out of their disability, right? That they're being led around the town. They seem to have some kind of mystical vision that other people lack. So not much is known about him. He was probably named Arthur Blake. He seems to have started on the medicine show circuit, which, again, not atypical for these guys. His first record is Early Morning Blues and West Coast Blues. West Coast Blues is an amazing guitar instrumental, and you should definitely listen to that. That was on Paramount, and it was first advertised October 2nd, 1926. So that's pretty early. He recorded 68 more blues numbers for Paramount over the next 4 years. His popular records include Hot Potatoes, Southbound Rag, with Johnny Dodds on clarinet and the drummer Jimmy Bertrand, who played xylophone and slide whistle, and so emulating the jug band sound. So he has a lot of really great songs. He's one of my favorite performers. Maybe try to spend a little time listening to him. You also have Tampa Red and Thomas Dorsey, and here's a good example of how the Piedmont Blues isn't always just guitar, because Thomas Dorsey, of course, is a pianist. And so Tampa Red, the guitarist, was born in Smithville, Georgia, but he was raised in Tampa, Florida. He toured on the Toba circuit and started recording in 1928. And he teams up with the pianist Georgia Tom, that was his stage name at that time, later known by his real name, Thomas A. Dorsey, who will, as we'll see, he was the pianist for Ma Rainey, and then later he's considered the father of black gospel music, and we'll talk about that soon. And they teamed up in Chicago. And the Chicago is really an area where a lot of these blues artists go to have a better life. There are more clubs, obviously, in Chicago. There are more playing opportunities. There are more recording opportunities. So around 1925, they're in Chicago, and they create the most celebrated guitar-piano duo of that period. In 1928, they record the fairly raunchy ragtime song with a lot of blues elements. So again, that distinction not so clear, called It's Tight Like That, and it sells 7 million copies, and that is as huge as it sounds for that time. That's a lot of copies. Tight Like That is one of the really popular tunes, and because of, there really was no sheet music, so therefore there really was no copyright for this song. Everyone does a version of it. There's a Louis Armstrong version. This is a very widely recorded song. In 1931, Dorsey's wife and child dies, and that's when he writes "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," and he devotes himself to gospel music. And we'll talk more about that soon. There'll be another session that deals with that in greater detail. Another figure, a solo guitar and singing figure from the Piedmont area, is Reverend Gary Davis. He didn't become super successful during his own youth when he was first recording. He really becomes successful in the 50s when there's a revival for these old blues artists in the 50s and the early 60s. He's from Greenville, South Carolina, but he moved to New York City to avoid the lynching culture of the South. He grew up in and continued the string band tradition typical of South Carolina. He's got this very fast and assured finger-picking style in a wide range of repertoire. So a very impressive figure, and made a huge mark on the folk revival of the 50s into the 60s. Another very interesting figure is Mississippi John Hurt. Mississippi John Hurt recorded for OK Records in 1928. He recorded it in New York, so this was not one of the remote recordings. He was given train fare to come up to New York and record, and he hated New York, and he hated recording, and he decided he wasn't going to bother with it anymore. He had some local success in Mississippi, in a small town called Avalon, and he didn't particularly want to deal with New York and OK Records or any of the rest of it. So he recorded this really wonderful set of songs, and then just disappears from the scene. Now, in the early 1960s, late 50s, and early 60s, of course, there's the folk revival. And one of the things that happens with the folk revival is this interest in these old recordings. And so you have people like Dick Spotswood and various figures like that, who become obsessed with these old recordings that they're finding in record shops. And that's how Robert Johnson became famous again, and so on in the late 50s, early 60s, was this rediscovery in record shops of these forgotten recording artists. Well, Mississippi John Hurt, because he recorded so little, was a collector's dream in a lot of ways. His style is, as you'll hear when you listen to him, it's this very interesting adaptation of ragtime style where the thumb is super strong, super secure, but the upper voice is this gently syncopated. It doesn't call a lot of attention to itself, but it's just very engaging, and the way that his voice interweaves with his guitar is really something. So you have the folk revival, you have all these artists that are coming back out of the woodwork that, have been retired for a number of years, but nobody knows what had happened in Mississippi John Hurt. He just made this handful of recordings and then he's gone. But of course, one of the songs is called Avalon Blues, and he talks about Avalon and refers to it as his home. And so Dick Spotswood gets the idea of looking for Avalon, right? Well, there is no Avalon in Mississippi that he can find, so he thinks, oh, well, I must have it wrong. But then he gets an old map. He gets a map from the 1920s, and he finds that there was an Avalon, and he goes to the area where it had been, and he knocks on a random door. He says, do you happen to know a guy named John Hurt? They say, oh, you mean the old farmer down the road? And he goes, I don't know. So he goes down to the old farm, and sure enough, there's John Hurt. Has no idea. He had retired from music. He hasn't played guitar other than for his own entertainment for years, decades really, because this is 1963. He recorded in 1928 and dropped out of music pretty much after that, just became a farmer. So he's shocked as hell that somebody's looking for him and is interested in those records, but not only that, they want him to tour. And so this is really the mainstay of his career, just like Reverend Gary Davis, where most of his music career comes from the revival, not from his initial output. Another important performer is of the style is Blind Willie McTell. Again, a very sophisticated approach to music in general. Really a wide range of songs, and a very interesting figure. Then there's Scrapper Blackwell and Leroy Carr, another piano guitar duo. Blackwell, the guitarist, was born in South Carolina, and Carr was born, the pianist was born in Tennessee, and they had a very jazz-inflected sound. In 1928, they were recording for Vocalion Records, and they recorded the song How Long Blues, which became the biggest blues hit of that very competitive year. That year had a lot of major releases. And we'll talk more about that song when we talk about the blues crooners, because Leroy Carr is one of the great blues crooners, but Scrapper Blackwell is one of the great Piedmont guitarists, so I wanted to include him just a bit here, and then we'll talk about him in greater detail in an upcoming session. Now, one of the great guitarists, maybe even, there's so many great guitarists of the 20s and 30s that to say that he's the greatest might feel a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly Lonnie Johnson is the most flexible of these guitarists, the most versatile. He is often considered one of the fathers of the jazz guitar. He's certainly one of the great country blues guitarists, but his style is so much smoother than most of the others. You can hear how jazz comes out of what he's doing. He's a very talented and just amazing guitarist. He's better known, though, at least at the time, as a singer. Now we celebrate him more as a guitarist, but then he was known as a singer. His style is a very complex mixture of Delta, Piedmont, and jazz approaches. In 1925, he won a blues contest and got a contract with OK Records. But he later regretted that a bit because he felt that it limited his reputation to being just a blues artist, and he was quite a bit more than that. But throughout the rest of his career, he was known as the OK Blues contestant, the winner of this competition for his contract. As you saw earlier, he worked with Victoria Spivey quite a bit, and those recordings are some of the best recordings that he made. He played with Louis Armstrong in the Hot Fives in 1927 on 3 amazing tracks, Hotter Than That, Savoy Blues, and I'm Not Rough. Listen at least to Hotter Than That, and you can hear some of his guitar playing and interaction with Louis Armstrong. In 1928, he plays with Ellington on Hot and Bothered, Move Over, and The Mooch, one of the really famous late 20s recordings by Ellington. And he really establishes jazz guitar. He's influential on Django Reinhardt and Charlie Christian. And in 1929, he records with the white jazz guitarist Eddie Lang. And those records are just some of the most amazing in the history of early recordings of the 20s and 30s. Their interaction is really something. So try to listen to some of that as well. And I talk a little bit about that on the Blues podcast. So that's it for this session, and I will see you for the next one.